Welcome guys to project 4 of our web design course. Now in this particular project we're going to make a bit of a web page about the some of the New Zealand black cap players, and yeah, let's have a quick look and see how that's going to look. Okay, so once again I've got OneNote open here, and let me just get this into a position where we can sort of see what the web page is going to look like. So as you can see here, this is effectively what we want to end up with. A little bit of a biography page. You can perhaps imagine that you might have a website about New Zealand Black Caps if you're interested in cricket, and a little bit of information about some of the key players here. Okay, with some pretty basic text about them. So this is just going to reinforce some of the work that we've done already on inserting images, putting text with that, having the text float around it, and also we'll use a property called clear to help us get this space here between the end of this text and the text which follows, because normally when you float these images here, the following text will simply move up here to the space available. So we want to basically put effectively like a break in the text here and force the following text to go underneath this image here. Okay, so we'll have a look and see how we can achieve that. Okay, so starting us off then, I've got my template open here. I've already put in the title, Black Caps 2015. So let's save this. So I need to have a project 4 folder, which I've already made. Okay, you need to get the images from your the OneNote. Okay, let's just bring that back over here for a moment. Okay, so if you go down to the bottom of the OneNote, okay, on the left hand side, okay, you've got the 4 images here, and there's the text file, the biography one, that we want to be able to access and get the text from. So I've already got my images in here. Text file I've already copied over and put into here as well. So if you need to, pause the video and get that put into here. Okay, and now we need to save this as our index file. Okay, so let's start to put a bit of the page structure together. Just bear with me there for a moment, folks, while I just sort out what's happening with Dreamweaver over here, where I'm just getting a bit of the text from. Not behaving itself sometimes. Okay, so what we're going to start off with is I want the page to be centered inside the browser window and to have a certain width to it. So to achieve that, what I'm going to do is to put in a div, which I hope you've looked at that video about what divs are and also about classes and IDs. So what I've done here is I've put in a virtual container, a div, given it an identifier, in this case a class called wrapper. I could also use an ID, but I'm going to use a class. I find them a little more flexible to use. We're going to put a heading in at the top here. We'll use an H1 because it's a main heading on the page. Okay, and what's going to follow next is I'll do this one sort of semi manually, but I am going to cut and paste over quite a bit of the code here, because this will be very similar for all these sections that we're doing. subheadings are going to have h2 tags, and then we're going to put in our image. You might recall the sort of syntax for that is we have img is the tag, and then we've got to have the path to the image. This is why sometimes it's not a bad idea to rename the images so that they're not too long a file name, without losing completely an idea of what the actual image is about. So that's not too bad. Brendan McCullum SML for small hyphens in there just to make it all one word, and it's a JPG file, JPEG. Now, as I've mentioned before, you should always have alt text. This is for people using screen readers, and sometimes browsers also use it as the sort of hover over text that you see when you hover over an image. Okay, so that's our alt text. Now, we don't really need to specify a width and height here. That'll be coming from the actual image itself. And we're going to add a class to this a little bit later, but for now I'm just going to put that for our image. Now, the next thing is I need to go to that text file. Here's the text file, and I need to grab this text about Brendan McCullum. So let's copy that, move it back into here, and let's put some p tags around this. Okay, so there's basically most of this done for Brendan McCullum now. Okay, let's have a look at this in a browser. Okay, so here we have it in Chrome, and it's not looking too bad. Of course, we'd like the text to be up here next to it. Excuse me, got a little bit of a cold coming. Okay, and yeah, that's pretty much what we'd like to repeat now for each of the players. So what I'm going to do is basically copy and paste that over in one go, and I'm just going to pause the video to do that. What you'll need to do is to put in the heading for each player, make sure that you're linking correctly to the image, and then use this text file here to bring in the text about each of the players. Okay, I'm going to, as I said, go and do that, and I'll catch you after I've managed to get that done. Okay guys, well, welcome back. I've managed to get those biographies for each of the players over, and have put the sources to the images in. Now, for some of these images here, the way I was using that to get them in initially was to use Adobe Dreamweaver, and so the width and the height have been brought over here. They don't need to be there. So let me just make it a bit more like what you have probably got. But do notice that when I have brought these images in, I've deliberately made them all the same width and height, just for the sake of this particular exercise. It would look not so great if the different images that we're seeing here were different widths and heights. So that was done in a Photoshop to basically resize some of these images here to the sizes that I want. So here's our page in Chrome. Okay, now what we want to achieve now is a bit of styling for the text in the H1, H2. I want to get this basically centered in the browser window with a definite width. I'm going to have a fixed width page here, and I want to move this text up to here. and you might recall from previous videos we'll use the float property to do that, and then we'll tackle the issue of trying to move the next player's information underneath the previous photo. Okay, so let's go and do that with our styling. Okay, so first of all, going to remove the default padding and margin. You could almost make that part of your template now, because it's something that we always want to effectively do. Okay, and with any rule like this you should always test it as you go. I do have my styling tags there, so hopefully that will, yep, has removed the padding and margin. That's great. Okay, now let's put in a rule for the body. Now I'm just going to put that in one go. Seen this before. Okay, so what this effectively does is to make sure that the with the padding set to 20 here and this margin one here, in fact I'm not totally sure if this is exactly what I'm after here. Let me take out those two. I think that's an error on my part, and we'll just have to check that padding setting as well. Yeah, so this is basically moving everything in padding of 20 on the left and the top, also the right and the bottom. Now actually I'd rather have that rule on our next one about this container called wrapper, and I'm going to make the font size 100% rather than 80. Okay, but I have specified a default font family here and the line height of 1.5 just to make the text hopefully a little easier to read, so a little bit more vertical space between the lines. Okay, so let's move on to now the wrapper. Now I'll type this one up. So we've got a full stop at the beginning, meaning we're targeting a class. If you had made this wrapper with an ID, you'd have to have instead that hash symbol there. Don't confuse the two, because effectively your styling won't work. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to specify a width of 800 pixels for this page. That's very narrow for today's monitors. Okay, and really that should be a wider page if you're going to go with a fixed page. Now what I'm going to do here is I want to have 20 pixels of margin on the left and the right, but I want to center it, so I'm using that auto to achieve that. Now hopefully we've got a fixed width page here and 20 pixels of margin on the left and right, sorry, top and bottom should say, but it is centered as well. May not be able to see that totally in this rather narrow window. Actually not too bad. Here's our 20 top. Can't really see the margin at the bottom because it just sort of flows off the page. Almost imagine it there though, 20 pixels. Okay, and here we have it centered as well inside the browser window. So that's looking pretty good. Notice that the default font family's taken over, and yeah, we're ready to move on. Now for H1, H2, I want to specify those different font sizes that we've used previously. So font size affects the size of the font, surprisingly enough, and I'm using percentages here to do that. So H1 210, I'm going to copy and paste that for H2 and make that instead 180. Don't use any H3 headings here, so I'm not going to put that in. am going to be obviously using paragraphs here. So font size for paragraphs. Okay, I'm going to be using 90%. And I want a bit of vertical space between the paragraphs, so one way to achieve that, pretty common way, use some margin on the bottom of each of the paragraphs. I keep forgetting my semicolons here, which is really bad practice. Okay, so we've got them all in now. Yep. Okay, and word spacing, just to give a bit more room between the words, make it easier to read. We'll put that as 200%, which is just double the normal word spacing. And for H1, H2, okay, I'm just going to go with the default font family here for this particular page. Okay, let's give that a run. Okay, that's looking reasonable. Perhaps the font is a little chunky for this, so maybe actually for H1, H2, I actually will specify a slightly different font family. Actually use this, but we'll just alter one of those, take out Vidal, which is a sort of chunky looking one, and perhaps we'll just see how that goes for now. Okay, it's looking a bit better. Okay, so looking pretty good. Another font we could possibly put in here is Tahoma, which is a standard font. And let's have a look and see how that looks. Okay, it's a possibility. I actually like the Arial look a bit better. So I'll put Tahoma down here as an alternate. Put Arial back. Okay, so what we need to do now is to style this up. Now, what we'll do for a start then is I'd like those images to be basically floating left. Now, we can achieve that by targeting each image, or another way of doing this, and this is a very common way, is that we're going to add a class to each image, and I'm going to call this class float left, because that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to write a class CSS rule called float left, and that will float our image to the left. Okay, so let's go float left. Now when we float something to the left, it's a good idea if we have some margin on the right, and I'm going to go with 8 pixels, and I'm also going to put a little bit on the bottom of 5 pixels. Okay, let's save that. Now I've only applied that rule to this particular image here of Brendan McCullum, so theoretically it's the only one where we should find the text floating up here. Okay, so that's exactly what I was expecting to see. Okay, this text has come up here and floated left, but notice how the rest of the block elements have also simply moved up, and that's not something we want. We want Kane Williamson to be underneath this image of Brendan McCullum here. Okay, and that's something we'll have to deal with, but for now what I'm going to do is simply copy that class and apply it to each of the other images. And when we save that and look at it, it's going to look pretty awful. but what we should see is that our text has floated up around each of the images. In fact, it's the image which is floating and the text is just doing what normal block elements do, but it looks like the text is floating around the image. Okay, now how do we achieve those breaks that we want? Well, a very common way of doing that is actually to add a div in that's got no width and height but has the property called clear attached to it. And let me show you what I mean by that. I'm going to put a div with a class. I'm going to call this clear float. This is a class rule that we haven't yet written. Do that in a moment. Okay, so let's put that in and then we'll close it immediately. No content in there. Okay, we're just going to have that. Alright, now I'll just do this one here and then we'll see how this looks, and then we'll put this same thing in other places. Got an extra quotation mark that we don't want. If you look at that at the moment, just run that again. Doesn't look any different. Okay, there's no extra spacing or whatever. That div has got 0 height and width, so therefore it's got no influence basically on the page at the moment. Okay, but let's now make it do something. So this class called clear float, so full stop clear float, because we're doing a class, and we're going to apply basically one property called clear, and I'm going to put one value in there, both. Now the way in which this works, let me try and see if I can explain this with my trusty old tablet here. Okay, so let me just see if I can grab a pencil tool. Okay, so what the clear property does, you can have the values of either left, or you could use right, or you can use both. Don't put all those things together, makes no sense. It's got to be either left, either right, or either both. Now what that does is that if you have some sort of element with a certain width and height, now if you apply to that element, let's say clear left, was your CSS rule, and so you've written a class, let's say clear left, and you apply that to that element there. If you have anything on the left side of this, let's say that was normally some text that was on the left hand side here, well, what this rule would effectively do is to force anything that happens to be to the left of this element to not be on the left. Now if there was room on the right, it might go there, but let's imagine that this thing is sitting right on the right hand edge, so effectively what would happen is we'd end up with a clear space on the left. And you can do that with clear right. That would take any particular element that you've got. If you apply clear right to that, well, you'd end up with some space on the right. Once again, be careful. If you apply clear right and there is space here in this region, well, the text might flow into that. So what we want to achieve here is we wanted to have this sort of effect. Okay, where we've got the next thing starting down here. Now we've got an invisible div basically sitting here at the moment. Let me just change that color just to demonstrate that. So we have put a div in this position here. Now if I specify clear both to that particular div, that class that's called clear float. It's got that rule clear both to it, and I apply it to that div. Well, what's going to happen is that that div is essentially going to clear anything on the left and the right. So anything that has moved up here, either on the right, left, or right, are going to be cleared and effectively forced down. So this next lot of text in the image and the writing that goes with it will be forced to go below this current image and text. Let's have a look and see how that's working in practice. Okay, so we have our div class of clear float. We've written the rule. Okay, let's have a look and see how it looks now. Okay, and that's exactly what I was hoping to achieve. That invisible div is basically sitting in here. Okay, go back to our page for a moment. Look where it is in the normal flow of things, this div. So anything which was to the left or to the right of that has basically been forced to go underneath. Let me just try and clarify one point that I'm just making here. Actually, it is the div which has cleared the content which was either to the left or to the right of it. So it's actually the div here which has been moved down underneath these things which were to the left and to the right of it. So that has then had the effect of pushing down the H2 and the image which follows. So it's the div now which is basically sitting underneath these. Now we can basically show that by, let's give this clear float container a little bit of width and height just for demonstration purposes here. Let's give this 100 pixels width and a height of, let's say, 20 pixels. And let's put a little bit of background color on this. And I'm just going to use black to make it stand out. Okay, that should be 100. Okay, so let's have a look and see if we can actually see that div now. Yeah, so there it is. Notice it's the thing which is moved down, not sitting up here still and the rest moving down underneath. Now this has been forced to clear, which was to the left or to the right of it, and the things which follow are now basically being forced down. Okay, so let's go back and remove all of these width and height things. Okay, now that we've got that class, here's the advantage of a class again. We can now basically reuse it, and I'm just going to put that exact same structure with this class of clear float now in these different locations here. Let's have a look at this. We'll see that we're almost finished. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. Now the other thing I had on the original was a little horizontal line, which is basically adding a bit of visual separation to each of those different sections. Now to achieve that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use what's called a horizontal rule. Now I need to be careful where we place that. I think this is the right location for it. I think it's self-closing. Let me just run that again. Yes, it is. That's the way that needs to be written. Okay, and notice that we have now that little horizontal line. adds a bit of visual separation between each of the sections there. Wouldn't look good if it was at the top there, or perhaps at the bottom, so we're just going to put it for the middle sections here. And once again, good idea if you just reuse code by copying and pasting. Okay, so there we go. There's our finished project 4 page. In the next one, we're going to have a look at trying to see if we can bring in some alternate fonts here, rather than just using the system ones. And actually just looking at this page here, I reckon that the names of Brendan and Kane, etc., probably a little too dominant. So this is where we can just play around with this a little bit. Okay, so perhaps for that, instead of 180, perhaps 150 might look a little better. I don't want to play around with this for too long, but yeah, that looks a lot more appropriate. Okay, alright, so there we go. There's our project 4. Have fun creating this, and don't forget that you need to take your finished product, your actual file itself. Okay, so if we go back to here, file, save, so you've already done that. So it's this file here that you then need to attach to your OneNote. Okay, catch you in class.